Hello again. Welcome back to New Testament Greek. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the ways in which English and New Testament Greek are related, and partially this is just for background information, to help you know a little bit about how we think about languages and their histories. But also, the main point of this is that understanding the relationship between English and New Testament Greek gives us a way to more effectively memorize vocabulary. There's two parts to this lecture. The first part is a linguistic family tree, in which I discuss a brief history of English and a brief history of New Testament Greek. And then the second part is all about how the Greek and Latin words in the English language got in there. I'm sure that most people in the course are familiar with the concept of the Romance languages. It's a name that we give to the languages that are ultimately derived from Latin. The ones that people are most familiar with are Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese, and you may be surprised to learn that Romanian is also one of these languages. These languages share common features and common vocabulary, all stemming from the fact that they evolved from Latin in the early part of the second millennium. What you may not be as familiar with is the fact that we can do the same thing with English. We can take a look at English and its close relatives and draw the same sort of family tree, although it's a little bit more complicated than with the Romance languages. When we look at the Germanic family tree, we see that English is in the far left-hand corner with its closest living cousin, Frisian, a language that most people have never heard of, and that is spoken by a very small number of people on the west coast of Denmark. English and Frisian go back to a language we call Anglo-Frisian, and before that they go back to a language we call West Germanic. This is the language from which modern-day English, Dutch, and German all stem. In the same way, we have slightly more distant cousins. The Scandinavian languages, Danish, Faroese, Icelandic, Norwegian, and Swedish, all stem from the North Germanic languages. And then on the far right, you'll see Gothic, an East Germanic language that died out in the 5th century. Now, if we go back even further, and we try to look at the relationship between the Germanic languages and the Romance languages, we can chart another family tree. And we call this the Indo-European family tree because it includes languages from Europe all the way to the Indian subcontinent. If you take a look at this Indo-European family tree, you'll see that we have our Germanic family, our Romance or Italic family, the Celtic languages, the Balto-Slavic languages, Albanian, Armenian, and the Hellenic languages. And it's within the Hellenic languages that New Testament Greek falls. What I want to point out about this family tree is that you'll notice, and I've circled them in red, Latin, Greek, and English are not all that closely related. They're in fact distant cousins. And I want to point this out because one of the misconceptions about English is that it's derived from Latin, or derived from Greek, when in fact they're fairly distant on the family tree. This of course begs the question, why do we have so many words then that have Latin and Greek origins? And that's the part that we'll talk about in part 2 of this lecture. In order to understand the presence of words of Latin and Greek origin in English, we're going to have to learn a little bit about the history of English and how it came to be as it is today. To start, we have to go back to Old English, which is the language of England in about the 8th century, and all these that I've mentioned so far are AD. Old English is the language of the epic poem Beowulf, which some of you may have had to read at one point, and it's fairly distinct from modern-day English. It's very closely related, in fact, to the root languages of modern German and modern Dutch. And if the intervening history had not happened, which we'll talk about in a second, it's very possible that modern English would look a lot more like modern German, but several different disruptions happened that changed the linguistic environment of English. The very first, in approximately the 9th through the 11th centuries, is the incursion of the Vikings into the British Isles. The Vikings brought several things to England. One of the things that they brought is red hair to Ireland and Scotland. But more importantly for our purposes, they brought a whole bunch of words of Scandinavian origin. And they show up in English and give us some of our difficulties in spelling. For example, the word knife But even simple words like they or are derived from Scandinavian languages. Interestingly enough, sometimes these words survive in matched pairs. We have both the Old Norse word, but also the English word. This is the difference between our usual word school, and then sometimes you'll hear the English word shoal, used especially in reference to a shoal of fishes. In the same way, the word garden is of Scandinavian descent, whereas the word yard, which is the same word with a slight change in consonant at the front, is the English equivalent. This would have been complicated enough in terms of the history of English, but in the 11th century, right after the end of the Viking Age, we had another invasion of England, this time by the Normans, and the Normans were speakers of Old French. This is where we get a lot of our words of French origin, things like the French beef or pork versus the native English words cow and pig, but it's also the first time that we get a lot of words of Latin origin coming into English. Words like omnipotent, royal, pensive. When you look these words up in the dictionary, you'll often see in their etymology, that is, their history, that they are words from Old or Middle French, and these are all the results of the Norman conquest. So to summarize up to this point, we've had Old English, the language of Beowulf. We have the incursion of the Vikings, who brought Scandinavian root words into English. We have the Normans, who brought words from French and Latin into English. And all of this results in what we call Middle English. This is the language of Chaucer, and to a lesser extent, it's the language of Shakespeare. The next period of time that's important for the history of the English language are the two periods known as the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. This is from about the 16th to the 18th century. These are, of course, two very different periods of thought, but because the processes of word formation and borrowing are the same, I've lumped them together. What we see in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment is conscious borrowing from the classical languages. What we get there is lots of technical terminology, words like biology, economics, orthodoxy. The good news about this borrowing is that a lot of the tough words that we learn in Greek will have English relatives, especially the ones that are used as technical terms. Some examples of this are the word pneumatic, which is from the Greek pneuma, which means wind or spirit, doxology, which is from the Greek doxa, glory, plus logos, word, even something like orthodontist, which is from the Greek orthos, straight, plus odontos, tooth. The slightly not so good news about this is that because of the manner in which English borrowed Greek words, there's not a lot of everyday words that have English relatives. So, for example, words for things like being, in Greek is eimi or going, Greek erkomai, or speaking, Greek lego, look quite different than the English to be, to go, to say. And so while it makes things a little bit harder, there's still good strategies for memorizing these words, and we'll talk about them before our first vocab quiz. And so to summarize, we've got a leg up when it comes to learning those really complicated words that might give you trouble in other languages. But we'll have to work a little bit harder for those everyday words. But thankfully, those everyday words show up again and again, and so we'll have a lot of practice with them.